Hi everyone, my name is Eshta. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate at University of Toronto. My paper is on whether structured documentation frameworks are appropriate and sufficient tools for reflexivity in dataset development. It is now well established that dataset development in machine learning is a value-laden process. From problem formulation to data processing, each step consists of decisions that have real-world effects and impacts. And it is because of these impacts that there's an increased call for reflexivity in data processes. Dataset documentation can facilitate reflexivity in two ways. Firstly, documentation eases communication and promotes accountability. And secondly, the act of documenting makes naturalized preconceptions and assumptions explicit. Structured documentation frameworks are standardized formats or templates to record documentation. One example is datasheets, which take the form of a list of questions and are considered the best practice for documentation. All frameworks, including datasheets, state explicitly that their motivation is to encourage careful reflection on processes of creating and maintaining datasets, including assumptions and implications of use. However, it remains unclear whether structured documentation frameworks actually effectively prompt for reflexivity and whether the responses accordingly demonstrate reflexivity. To that end, this work asks three questions. Firstly, how is reflexivity conceptualized within the FAccT literature? We started here by first compiling all the papers published in all years of FAccT that mentioned reflexivity. Generally, reflexivity has been discussed and conceptualized in many domains and disciplines in varying ways, but of the 84 papers that we found in FAccT, only a handful cited the constructivist and feminist reflexivity from scholars like Haraway and Harding, but a much larger portion cited Bourdieu's reflexivity. One specific paper went as far as to suggest that computer science as a whole considers reflexivity as conceptualized by Bourdieu only. For us, this raised the question that if scholarship on data and data practices is engaging selectively with one portion of the literature on reflexivity, how does this impact the way that reflexivity in data work is put into practice? Our analysis of FAccT papers found 6 themes which encompass topics that recurred as key features of how reflexivity is conceptualized. Firstly, discussions of marginalization and power in the literature state that reflexivity should consider the multiple hierarchies of power between researcher and research and between researcher groups, the consequence of hierarchical power dynamics, the inequality of access to knowledge production processes, etc. Reflexivity with attention to scholarly context should be critical of how the act of situating scholarship limits how questions are asked and evaluated in a given domain. This particular theme is very prominent in Bourdieu-inspired discussions of reflexivity. In the literature, attention to historical context took the form of arguments that reflexive work is that which is intentionally situated in a particular time, place, and sociocultural setting. The theme of questioning claims of neutrality rejects the notion of neutrality or objectivity within research and science. Claims of neutrality are opposed with embracing situatedness and claiming it a stronger form of objectivity. Next, some of the literature raises concerns that reflecting on positionality as a form of post hoc self-disclosure of demographics is limited in its impact and could be considered performative as compared to active reflexivity, which is fluid, dynamic, continuous, and pushes for moving beyond individual positionality to consider relationality. The last theme captures a common conclusion across the literature that transparency as documentation of process is not in itself a reflexive practice and remains insufficient, thus requiring accountability as well. Our second research question looked at how it is that our 6 identified themes are illustrated within structured documentation frameworks like datasheets, data statements, and nutrition labels. We asked this question to better understand whether or not reflexivity is possible through structured documentation and whether the frameworks are effectively prompting for reflexive data practices. There are 2 overall patterns that we found. All 3 frameworks that we analyzed did list transparency as part of their motivation, and by providing the means to document procedural decisions and details, structured documentation frameworks do support more transparent data work. The literature makes clear, however, that transparency without engagement with the other substantive features of reflexivity is not sufficient to make work reflexive. The second pattern that we observed is that some of the frameworks do engage with different reflexivity themes. For example, the nutrition labels criticize assumed neutrality and ask questions about the use of proxies in datasets. However, where frameworks do touch on reflexivity themes, they do so by asking creators to list positions or decisions, but do not go beyond this to prompt creators to consider implications. In effect, we can say that much of whether the frameworks improve reflexivity is left to the initiative of the dataset creators. This leads us to our third and final research question, which asked, how is it that dataset developers are demonstrating reflexivity through their responses to structured documentation frameworks? And for this question, we analyzed 36 datasheets. Overall, our qualitative exploration of the responses revealed a tendency for dataset creators to answer even those questions that do touch on reflexivity themes at minimal length and depth. At times, the answers to these questions even actively use the language of neutrality and objectivity that is critiqued within reflexivity literature. And so overall, we found no compelling argument that datasheets are, at present, being used as tools for reflexivity. In our paper, we identify barriers to practicing reflexivity, suggest ways to expand reflexivity at FAccT, provide resources and recommendations to aid in practicing reflexivity along each of the 6 themes, and list extensions to all the datasheet questions to better prompt reflexivity. Here, I have 2 extensions listed, and I'll be discussing the top one. One of the datasheet questions, which is paraphrased here, is, does the dataset contain all possible instances, or is it a sample? Here, we propose to extend the question by asking what other sampling approaches were considered, who is relevant but not represented, and why is this trade-off permissible? Decisions around sampling and representativeness are embedded in scholarly context and expertise, as well as individual experience and training. This question can prompt for reflexivity by asking dataset creators to explain whether different approaches to sampling were considered and what impact these choices may have. Overall, dataset documentation frameworks and practices aim to be reflexive, but currently fall short. This work identifies where the issues lie and makes recommendations and surfaces opportunities towards its improvement. Ultimately, dataset development is craft work, requiring reflexivity, criticality, and rigor. Approaching machine learning data work not as a technical precondition, but from the perspectives of information science fields like digital and data curation, archives, libraries, can highlight that the dataset development process comprises numerous design decisions and considerations towards adding value, oversight, preservation, and reuse. These are ideas that I've explored in my previous FAccT and NeurIPS papers, and that I teach along with reflexivity in my graduate course titled Caring About Datasets. If these are of interest to you, you can find me at the links on the slide. I'm also currently on the job market and would be happy to hear from you about opportunities. Thank you.